The wind howled like a wounded animal that night, rattling every window in my apartment 30 miles from Dad's farm. I lay awake, listening to the fury outside, thinking about the old barn that had weathered countless storms over the past 60 years. Built by my grandfather's calloused hands, it had always seemed indestructible to me as a child. My phone buzzed at 3 in the morning. Dad's gruff voice cut through the static connection. "Barn's damaged pretty bad. Whole north wall's compromised." I could hear the weight in his words, though he'd never admit to being shaken. The barn wasn't just storage for him. It held decades of memories, tools passed down through generations, and the last remnants of the dairy operation that had sustained our family for years. "I'll drive out first light," I told him. "Don't need charity," he replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the ceiling until dawn broke grey and weary over the city. I'd grown up on that farm, spent countless summers learning the value of hard work under Dad's watchful eye. The barn had been my playground, my refuge, my classroom in the art of fixing things that seemed beyond repair. As I loaded my truck with tools, I thought about the distance that had grown between us since I'd moved to the city for work. Maybe this storm, as destructive as it was, had provided an opportunity to bridge that gap. I had no idea that repairing the barn would teach me lessons about family that I never expected to learn. The drive to the farm took me through familiar countryside, past fields where I'd learned to drive the old Ford tractor, past the creek where I'd caught my first fish. But nothing prepared me for the sight of the barn. The massive oak tree that had shaded our farmhouse for generations lay across the barn's north wall like a fallen giant. Splintered boards jutted out at impossible angles, and I could see clear through to the hayloft where I'd spent countless childhood hours reading and dreaming. Dad stood surveying the damage, his weathered hands on his hips, his face expressionless in that way he'd perfected over decades of farming setbacks. He looked older somehow, smaller against the backdrop of destruction. "Insurance adjuster came by yesterday," he said without looking at me. "Says it's a total loss on that section." I walked the perimeter, assessing what could be salvaged. The foundation was solid. Grandpa had built things to last. Most of the frame could be saved with some reinforcement. The roof needed patches, but the main structure was sound. "It's not as bad as it looks," I said, running my hand along a beam that had held firm despite the tree's impact. Dad snorted. "You always were an optimist." But I caught something in his voice, a flicker of hope he was trying to suppress. We spent the morning cataloguing the damage, working side by side in comfortable silence. It felt good to be back, to feel useful in a way that city life rarely provided. I'd forgotten how satisfying it was to work with my hands, to see immediate results from physical effort. Over coffee in Mom's old kitchen, Dad and I spread the insurance paperwork across the worn wooden table. The payout would cover basic materials, but labor costs would eat up most of the budget. "I could hire Jake Morrison's crew," Dad said, studying the estimates. "But they're backed up for months after the storm hit half the county." I set down my mug and looked at him directly. "What if I did it?" His eyebrows raised slightly. "You've got that city job. I've got vacation time saved up and weekends." I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my calendar. I could take 2 weeks off, get the main structure done, then finish the details on weekends. Dad was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the damaged barn. I knew he was weighing pride against practicality, his natural stubbornness against genuine need. "You remember how to frame a wall?" he asked finally. I smiled. "You taught me well enough. It's not play construction like when you were 10. "I know that, Dad." He nodded slowly. "We'd need to rent some equipment. Got to do it right, or it's not worth doing at all." Agreed. We spent the afternoon making lists, measuring, planning. Dad's construction knowledge was encyclopedic. He'd built half the structures on the farm himself over the years. I took notes, asked questions, felt that familiar comfort of learning from someone who truly knew his craft. As evening approached, I realized this wasn't just about repairing a building. It was about repairing something between us that had been damaged by years of distance and different life choices. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, perfect weather for construction. I'd taken 2 weeks of vacation, something I'd never done for purely personal reasons before. My supervisor had been understanding, even envious. "Sounds like honest work," he'd said. "Send pictures." Dad was already up when I arrived at dawn, coffee made, tools organized with military precision. He'd always been an early riser, but I sensed excitement beneath his careful composure. We started by removing the damaged boards, salvaging what we could. Each piece told a story: knife marks from cutting hay bales, smooth wear patterns from decades of use, nail holes that spoke of previous repairs and modifications. "Your grandfather installed this section in '68, Dad said, indicating a wall panel we were carefully removing. "Used lumber from the old Miller place when they tore down their barn." I ran my fingers along the weathered wood, feeling connected to family history in a way I hadn't experienced in years. In the city, everything was new, disposable, temporary. Here, every board had provenance, purpose, permanence. The physical work felt good after months of sitting at a desk. My hands remembered the weight of a hammer, the resistance of old nails, the satisfaction of clean, straight cuts. Dad worked beside me with the efficiency of long practice, anticipating my needs, guiding without lecturing. By noon, we'd cleared enough debris to see the full scope of the work ahead. It was substantial but manageable, especially with Dad's expertise guiding the project. As we broke for lunch, I felt more optimistic about the repair than I'd been since seeing the initial damage. The second day established our working rhythm. Dad would arrive with coffee and a plan. I'd set up tools and materials, and we'd work until the heat became unbearable in the afternoon. Then we'd retreat to the shade, drink sweet tea Mom had made before she'd passed, and plan the next day's tasks. Dad was a demanding teacher, insisting on precision in every cut, perfect alignment in every board, but his standards pushed me to work better than I'd ever worked before. I found myself taking pride in craftsmanship that would never be fully visible once the job was complete. "Measure twice, cut once," he'd say whenever I reached too quickly for the saw. "Your grandfather's rule." We raised the first new wall section on Wednesday, a moment that felt ceremonial despite its practical nature. Dad had called our neighbor Bill Thompson to help with the heavy lifting, and seeing the three of us raising that wall together felt like participating in an old tradition, something men had done on farms for generations. "Looking good," Bill said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Your boy's got good hands for this work." Dad nodded approvingly, and I felt a flush of pride I hadn't experienced since childhood. In my professional life, success was measured in abstractions, metrics, evaluations, advancement. Here, success was immediate and tangible, a wall that stood straight and strong. That evening, Dad and I sat on the porch examining our work. The damaged section was taking shape, beginning to look like it belonged with the original structure. I felt satisfied in a way that no work accomplishment had ever provided. Thursday brought complications. When we removed a section of seemingly solid wall, we discovered dry rot that had been hidden for years. The damage extended further than we'd realized, requiring additional materials and completely revising our timeline. Dad stared at the rotted studs with the expression of someone who'd seen this movie before. Farming teaches you that problems hide behind problems. I called the lumberyard to adjust our order, watching our careful budget calculations evaporate. Dad insisted on replacing everything that showed even slight deterioration. Do it right, or it'll just fail again in a few years. The setback was frustrating, but working through it together felt like an important test. In my city job, problems usually had clear solutions and defined timelines. Here, we had to adapt, improvise, and accept that some things couldn't be rushed. Dad's patience was instructive. He dealt with equipment failures during harvest, animals getting sick at the worst possible times, weather that refused to cooperate with human schedules. This was just another problem to solve methodically. We spent the afternoon removing and replacing affected framing, work that was tedious but necessary. I found myself appreciating Dad's insistence on quality over speed. We weren't just fixing the barn, we were ensuring it would serve future generations. "Your kids might play in this barn someday," Dad said during a break. It was the first time he'd mentioned the possibility of grandchildren, and something in his voice suggested he hoped that possibility was real. As the day ended, our progress looked minimal, but the foundation for lasting repair was solid. The weekend brought my brother Tom out from the city with his two boys, ages 8 and 10. Dad immediately put them to work sorting screws and fetching tools, the same jobs we'd done as children. Watching him teach them basic tool use brought back memories of my own construction education. "Screwdrivers got to match the screw head," he told my nephew Jake. "Wrong tool makes everything harder." Tom helped with the heavy lifting, but lacked patience for detailed work. He'd always been more interested in the farm's business side than its physical demands. But his boys were fascinated by the construction process, asking endless questions that Dad answered with surprising patience. "Why do you have to put the boards exactly here, Grandpa?" "Because that's where they carry the weight. Building's only as strong as its weakest joint." I realized Dad was passing down more than construction techniques. He was teaching principles about craftsmanship, responsibility, and taking pride in work that would outlast the worker. The same lessons he'd taught me, though I'd been too young to fully appreciate them at the time. We made significant progress over the weekend, installing most of the new framing. The boys' enthusiasm was infectious, reminding me why I'd loved working on the farm as a child. There was something pure about creating something useful with your own hands. Sunday evening, as Tom's family prepared to leave, Dad pulled me aside. "You're doing good work," he said simply. "Better than I expected." And coming from Dad, that was high praise indeed. Monday of my second vacation week dawned cloudy and humid, threatening rain that would halt our progress. Dad checked the weather forecast obsessively, worried about protecting our work from moisture. We'd reached the point where precision mattered most, installing siding, fitting trim, ensuring everything aligned perfectly. This was detail work that required patience and skill I hadn't used in years. Dad demonstrated the proper technique for installing clapboard siding, showing me how to maintain consistent exposure, how to nail without splitting, how to handle corners and openings. His movements were economical, practiced, perfect. "Your grandfather taught me this when I was 16, he said. "Same way his father taught him?" I tried to match his technique, but my first attempts were clumsy. Dad corrected my grip, adjusted my stance, guided my hands until the motion felt natural. It was the most direct teaching he'd done since I was a child. "Take your time," he counseled when I rushed a difficult cut. Wood doesn't forgive impatience. Gradually, my work improved. I began to anticipate problems, to see solutions before they became necessary. The barn was teaching me patience I'd never learned in my hurried professional life. By Wednesday, we had the exterior nearly complete. Standing back to admire our work, I felt a deep satisfaction. The new section matched the old so well, it was difficult to see where repairs had been made. "Looks like it belongs," Dad said, and I heard approval in his voice. Thursday and Friday focused on interior repairs, replacing damaged floor joists, reinforcing the hayloft, rebuilding storage areas that had been crushed by the falling tree. This work was less visible but equally important. Dad showed me how to sister new joists to damaged ones, doubling their strength while preserving the original structure's integrity. Every technique had a reason. Every shortcut had consequences that might not appear for years. Farmers can't afford to do things twice, he explained. Have to get it right the first time. Working in the barn's dim interior, surrounded by the smell of new lumber and old hay, I felt connected to family history in unexpected ways. Dad told stories I'd never heard, about learning construction from his father, about repairs he'd made over the decades, about hopes he'd had for the farm's future. "Thought you boys might take over someday," he admitted while we were installing blocking between joists. "Guess I always knew better, but a man hopes." I realized this wasn't just about repairing storm damage. Dad was preserving something he hoped might matter to future generations, even if his sons had chosen different paths. We worked until after dark both nights, using extension lights to finish critical connections. The work was demanding, but I found myself reluctant to stop. Soon, I'd return to my desk job, to climate-controlled offices and abstract problems. Friday evening, as we cleaned up tools and prepared for the weekend, Dad surveyed our work with obvious satisfaction. "She's solid now," he said. "Better than before the storm." My final weekend on the project focused on finishing touches, painting, installing hardware, replacing windows that had been broken by flying debris. Tom returned to help, bringing a sense of family completion to the work. Dad had chosen paint colors that matched the original barn exactly, mixing custom shades to preserve its authentic appearance. We spent Saturday morning applying primer, working systematically from top to bottom. "Paint's not just decoration," Dad explained to his grandsons, who were helping with brushwork on lower sections. "It's protection, keeps the wood from rotting, metal from rusting." The boys took their painting responsibilities seriously, applying paint with careful concentration. I watched Dad guide their work with the same patience he'd shown me, and I wondered if they'd remember these moments decades later, the way I was remembering similar experiences from my own childhood. Sunday brought the final painting, installation of new hardware, and cleanup of construction debris. The project was nearly complete, and the barn looked magnificent, restored to its original strength and dignity. Standing back to admire our finished work, I felt proud of what we'd accomplished together. The barn would serve the farm for decades to come, a testament to quality craftsmanship and family cooperation. Dad walked the perimeter one final time, checking details with the thoroughness of someone whose reputation depended on quality work. "Good job," he said finally. "She'll last." It was the highest praise he could offer, and I treasured it more than any professional commendation I'd ever received. Monday morning arrived too soon. I loaded my tools reluctantly, already missing the satisfaction of physical work and the closeness I'd rediscovered with Dad. The past 2 weeks had been transformative in ways I was still processing. "Thanks for your help," Dad said as I prepared to leave. "Couldn't have done it without you." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Dad wasn't given to excessive praise or emotional displays, but his appreciation was genuine. "It was good to be home," I replied, and meant it more than I'd expected. The drive back to the city gave me time to reflect on what had changed. I felt more connected to family history, more appreciation for craftsmanship, more understanding of Dad's values and perspectives. The barn repair had been about more than fixing storm damage. My apartment felt sterile after 2 weeks of farm life. I missed the smell of fresh-cut lumber, the satisfaction of visible progress, the purposefulness of essential work. My desk job, which had always provided intellectual satisfaction, now seemed somehow insubstantial. I called Dad that evening to check on him, ostensibly to ensure he was securing tools properly and maintaining our work schedule. Really, I wanted to hear his voice, to maintain the connection we'd rebuilt. "Everything's holding up fine," he reported. "Just finished staining the new trim." Over the following weeks, I fell back into my urban routine, but something had fundamentally shifted. I found myself planning weekend visits to the farm, looking for excuses to work with my hands, questioning career choices that had once seemed obviously correct. 3 weeks after returning to the city, an envelope arrived with Dad's familiar handwriting. Inside was a detailed invoice for lumber, hardware and labor, itemized down to the last nail and calculated at prevailing contractor rates. My initial reaction was shock, then hurt, then anger. Had the entire experience been some elaborate setup? Had Dad's appreciation been fake? The total came to several $1,000s, money I definitely didn't have readily available. I called immediately, my emotions running hot. "What's this bill about?" Dad's voice was calm, unruffled by my obvious agitation. "Exactly what it says, materials and labor for barn repair." "But I was helping family." "You were, and you did excellent work." "Worth every penny of what I'm charging." I sat in my apartment, staring at the invoice, trying to process what was happening. Had I completely misunderstood the nature of our project? Had Dad viewed me as hired labor rather than a son helping his father? "I don't understand," I said finally. "I know you don't, but you will." The line went dead, leaving me with more questions than answers. I spent that evening pacing my apartment, alternately furious and confused. The bill felt like a betrayal of everything I thought we'd shared during those 2 weeks of working together, but underneath the anger was hurt, deep, personal hurt at the idea that Dad had reduced our experience to a financial transaction. I'd treasured those memories, had begun planning more visits to the farm, had felt closer to him than I had in years. I didn't call Dad back for a week, letting anger and confusion simmer while I decided how to respond. The invoice sat on my kitchen counter, a daily reminder of what felt like betrayal. Finally, I drove back to the farm, determined to confront him directly. I found him in the barn, organizing tools with his usual precision. The repair work looked even better, with some weathering, blending seamlessly with the original structure. "We need to talk about this bill," I said without preamble. Dad nodded, setting down the wrench he'd been cleaning. "Figured you'd be back." "I don't understand what game you're playing." "No game," he replied calmly, "just teaching you something important." He led me to the kitchen, poured coffee, and sat across from me at the same table where we'd planned the repairs. "Your work was worth what I charged," he began. "Good craftsmanship, attention to detail, dedication to quality. Any contractor would have charged the same. But I'm your son." "Exactly." His eyes met mine directly. "And I wanted you to understand the value of what you gave me." I stared at him, beginning to glimpse something larger than a simple construction project. "All your life, you've measured success by salary, by position, by abstract achievements," he continued. "But what you did here had real value, permanent value, the kind of work that matters." The invoice wasn't about money, I realized. It was about recognition, about understanding the worth of skilled labor, about appreciating craftsmanship in a world that had taught me to devalue physical work. "Keep the invoice," Dad said. "Frame it if you want, but understand what it represents." I never paid that invoice, and Dad never asked me to. Instead, it became something else entirely, a reminder of lessons learned, value created, and connections rebuilt. Over the following months, I visited the farm regularly, always finding projects that needed attention. Dad and I worked together on fence repairs, equipment maintenance, and small construction jobs that kept my hands busy and my relationship with him strong. The barn stood as a testament to our collaboration, weathering subsequent storms with the strength we'd built into it. Neighbors often commented on the quality of the repair work, not knowing where the old structure ended and our contribution began. I began to see my city job differently, not as inherently more valuable than physical work, but as simply different. Both had their place, both required skill and dedication, both contributed to society's functioning. The invoice still sits framed in my home office, a reminder of the most valuable payment I ever received. Not money, but understanding of what truly matters. Dad taught me that worth isn't always measured in dollars, that some gifts can only be recognized when they're properly valued. When people ask about the framed invoice, I tell them it's the most expensive education I ever received and the best bargain I ever made. It cost me nothing and taught me everything about the relationship between father and son, between work and value, between helping and understanding. The barn repair became much more than fixing storm damage. It repaired something in both of us that we hadn't realized needed fixing. Our connection to each other and our understanding of what makes work meaningful. Thank you for listening to this story of family, work, and the unexpected lessons that come from getting our hands dirty. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What part of the world are you listening from? Have you ever had a similar experience with family or unexpected life lessons? Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this story, and I'll see you in the next one.